Hello and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Sharon Short. Hey, Sharon, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. To
Good.
give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Sharon Short is a regular contributor to Writer's Digest magazine with her Level Up Your Writing Life column. She teaches a number of courses for writers, including those via the Writer's Digest University. As Jess Montgomery, she writes the Kinship Historical Mystery series set in the 1920s Appalachia and inspired by Ohio's true first female sheriff. As Sharon Short, her book-length works range from a coming-of-age novel set in the 1950s, My One Square Inch of Alaska, as well as two mystery series, the comedic-with-a-twist-of-social-satire Josie Toadfern mysteries, and the electronic-gumshoe Patricia Delaney series. And I was fortunate enough to hear Sharon speak at the Writer's Digest conference, and she was talking about backstory, but I'm tentatively titling this discussion On the Mountaintop or in the Valley. Because Sharon, what I thought was really interesting is that although your talk was generally about backstory, you had two aspects that I think people don't really associate necessarily with backstory. And I'm really going to just ask you to talk about those two, and we'll see where the conversation goes from there. One of them, those questions being, is the character on their way up or on their way down?
I think it's interesting to think about where your character is in life just before the story starts relative to that character's desires, wishes, goals. So it's partly a where's the character in status wise in society? Are they wealthy? Are they not? Are they achieving in the traditional markers that we look at or not? That's part of it. But more importantly, is where do they fit in terms of what they really want? To make it even more juicy, perhaps they don't even know or no longer remember what they really want, what they really need out of life. But since you created them, you can decide that. You can know. So, for example, let's say you have somebody who, and I'm just making this up on the spot, so I'm sure everyone will have better ideas for their own characters and their own stories. But let's say you have somebody who started out in life learning dance and they really wanted to be a professional dancer, or at least they thought they did. And they suffer an injury and they cannot pursue that. So they become an accountant, a much more practical avenue anyway. And maybe on the surface, they're making good income as an accountant. They live in a nice house. They're doing well. So they're on the mountaintop, according to everybody around them. But deep down, they're in the valley because they didn't get to do what they wanted to do to become a professional dancer. And of course, since they've had this injury and they're older now, they're probably not going to become a professional dancer at that point. Let's say your character's 40, but there's something nagging within, and what they maybe need to figure out over the course, their internal journey over the course of the story could be recognizing that loss. Maybe they haven't recognized that loss till now. They've just pushed it aside and asking themselves, okay, I am not going to be in a professional ballet in a major city, but what can I do that will fulfill that niche in me after all? Maybe I need to go take ballroom dancing classes, and that will tap into the desire, the deep desire I've always had. So they're in a valley in terms of their own needs, and they need to work towards getting on that mountaintop. And then, of course, you can tweak it from genre to genre. If you're writing a romance, maybe they fall in love with the ballroom dancing instructor. Or if it's women's fiction, maybe it shakes up their marriage. Or if it's a mystery, maybe that poor ballroom dancing instructor is murdered. I don't know. There's all kinds of ways you can play with it depending on the genre that you're writing in. But that's what I mean by taking a look at where your character is internally and externally just before the start of your story, because that will inform their decisions of what they're willing to risk and what they're not willing to risk throughout the course of the story. For example, if your character really wanted to be a professional ballet dancer, never got injured, became a professional ballet dancer. So both externally and internally, they are at the top of the mountain. That's a very different story going forward.
Is
Does that make
that
sense?
it absolutely makes sense. Is that a
But
problem? Is that a red flag if they're at the mountaintop, both in the backstory and in the story that's on the page?
oh, I don't think so. I think it depends on what is the story you want to tell? What is the story demanding of you? Maybe it's the story of somebody who does have it all, and that's a lot to risk to pursue a new relationship or to solve a murder. And so then the question becomes, okay, you have it all internally and externally, everything's in alignment, you're at the top of the mountain, that's where you want to be. Oh, but now you're faced with, we'll just use mystery because that's what I write. You're faced with finding that you're involved in a murder mystery and you're part of trying to solve this. Do you turn your back on that? That's one avenue for your character. Or do you fully get involved, and maybe for whatever reason that means risking everything that you have? And then of course that leads to, well, if you're willing to risk having everything that you have on your mountaintop, you've got the career you want and everybody around you's like, yeah, you, and you're willing to risk that, that means that there's something even more important to you than this achievement. Well, what is that? Maybe it's family loyalty, maybe it's a social justice issue. And so that can become an interesting question too. For somebody to risk everything for a deeper cause is interesting in and of itself. So I don't think it's a red flag. I think you have to trust your gut and know what's the story that you need to tell. Where's the story taking you? Which is a little woo-woo, but
Well, it
that's
does
okay.
seem as if a way of expanding on this valley and mountaintop metaphor is that I guess there should be the moment when the character looks over the edge of the cliff.
Mhm.
They're either at the mountaintop and they're looking over the edge of the cliff and they're in danger of falling, or
Mhm.
if you're writing a different kind of book, they're at the bottom and they see what seems like an unscalable cliff ahead of them. And
Right.
those are, as you're saying, two very different stories.
Yeah, two very, and that leads us to the notion of the point of no return, like on the hero's journey, where, if you're looking over the cliff and you realize, yeah, if I'm going to do this, hopefully I got a parachute because here I go. Or you're in the valley and you're going to trudge up, and at some point it's going to be more dangerous. You're not going to be able to turn back. You're going to have to keep going. So I think that's an interesting moment, yeah, where you don't want to set up a story where the character can decide at any given time, I'm out, I tap out, this has been enough. You want to put
Yeah.
them in a situation where now that you've made this decision, you got to keep going.
Yeah. Or they've jumped off the cliff and they thought they had a parachute, and partway down they realize they don't.
Yeah,
All sorts of interesting ways you can play out this
that's right.
mountain and valley metaphor.
That's right.
The scenario you described with a person who wanted to be the ballerina and maybe became the ballroom dancer instead, I can imagine that being, let's play it out as the storyline for the primary character. And you could either have that be the storyline, or you could have the whole story focused on what has happened now that she's a ballroom dancer and only be obliquely referencing her background as a wannabe
Right.
ballerina. How do you
Mhm.
assess how much of the backstory you want to provide if it's not intrinsic to the duration of time covered by the main plot of the book?
Yeah, backstory is tricky. I always fall into the trap of dumping too much backstory at the beginning in my initial drafts, and then I cut it all and put it in a separate file so that I can then pluck from it. As you figure, it helps if you can figure out your character's backstory, but recognize that none of this is set in stone. I just, for example, on a project I'm working on, spent a whole weekend figuring out in detail the backstory, the timeline, et cetera, of my main character and a couple of secondary principal characters. But I know that that's going to shift as I'm writing the novel. I will at some point go, oh no, this is when this needed to happen, or this other thing needed to happen. So when I'm writing and particularly revising, what I try to do with backstory is share as little of it as I possibly can until the moment where if I don't share, this piece of backstory, the rest of the story as I'm telling it isn't going to make sense. So there are really always two stories going on in a novel or in our lives. There's the story as it's unfolding on the surface. The detective goes and gets some clues and talks with the fellow investigator, and then they're threatened or whatever. That's the surface story. But underneath is that backstory. What led them to that moment? Why are they involved? Because backstory is really what drives that internal arc. Like, what do they need to learn to become a more evolved, if you will, human being? But I think what you really want is to like just dollop that in at the very last second. And sometimes it can just be maybe at the same dance studio where our main character, will call her Sue, is learning, she's shown up early because she needs extra help with the rumba. I don't know. Obviously, I've never taken ballroom dancing, so I have no idea what I'm talking about.
I've taken ballroom dancing, and that's a completely legitimate example.
That's completely legit. Okay, so great. So she's showing up. She needs a little extra help on rumba, but it's a studio that's shared with younger dancers. And so she sees the little ballerinas leaving. And so maybe it just triggers a briefest, like 2-sentence, 3-sentence moment where she remembers being that age and the excitement. Like she's just like that one little child who's so excited and focused. And instead of the other kids who are kind of wandering off and ready for snacks, she remembers being that kid. And then maybe a chapter or two later, something else happens that triggers a little bit more. So you're just giving little dollops, little threads to the reader that this is important. And then maybe at some point, it all comes out. There's a conversation with a trusted friend or an aunt or her new lover, whomever, that brings out, once upon a time, I haven't thought about this in years, but I wanted to be this kind of dancer. And by doing it that way, because readers want things to move pretty fast. We're all very visual. We watch there's a lot of great television shows, a lot of great movies. And so our brains have been trained to look at story that way. And so the way to replicate that a bit on the page is to just hold that off rather than giving a whole bio all at once. And if you give those little dollops, by the time you get to the scene a third of the way in or however far, where the character is really remembering at length or is talking to a trusted ally about her deepest desires from the past, the reader's prepped for it. Oh, this isn't out of the blue. And by now I'm really curious because, well, she noticed that one little ballerina and maybe her mind wandered while she was doing the rumba exercise and she did a pirouette instead or whatever. So the reader by then is, what's going on with this whole ballet fascination? And then they want that scene where it's all laid out and they go, okay.
This is making me think of my one foray into editing. And the book I was editing was in fantasy, not a genre that I write myself. This was problem number one. And fortunately, this potential client and I did a sample edit, which proved that we were really unsuited to work together. But my primary concern with the material he sent me, the first however many chapters, was that this isn't backstory, but it's kind of backstory. It's like location backstory rather than character backstory. And it was very detailed description of the setting. So they were on the planet and they turned on the light, which was powered by light from the two suns I'm making this up, but powered by the two lights. And then he put on his coat, which was created from the Martian sheep that they had shared earlier in the year. And I was never successful. Like every time I would push back on this, his response was, well, it's all carefully researched. It was based on an actual thing, but, moved to a fantasy realm. All very carefully researched, and it's important for people to be able to see it in the environment. Now, I objected to it because it really slowed down the beginning, but right. I can kind of empathize with where he was coming from, because what you were saying about when the reveal happens, it can be a surprise, but it has to be inevitable, I guess, of the backstory. It can't seem disconnected for the reader, right, even if it is a pleasant surprise for them when they get it. But if you've been imagining this planet with one sun for 50 pages and now you find out they're two sons, that's kind of a different thing. That can be.
Right.
So if you're setting out the backstory of the setting rather
Mhm.
than the backstory of a character, do you have any comments about that? That
Oh,
example just
sure.
popped into my head.
No, that's a great question because often we'll talk about setting almost as a character, right? And of course, writers go back and forth about is setting a character or not. Setting doesn't have personal stakes, but it's definitely a very important element of any story. And I do empathize with both you and the fantasy novelist because I write historical mystery. And so there's world building that goes on. 1920s is very different than the 2020s. 100 years ago, and my stories are set in Appalachia, a very rural territory. So it's different than what most of us in the 2020s experience. So how do I bring that to life without stopping the action and describing how to start a Model T or why they don't have a Model T and they're still using a donkey and wagon, or who has electric and who doesn't. So it's like that two sons example. And what I finally came to was, yeah, you definitely want to build in those hints, especially if it's a world and whether it's fantasy or a time and place very different from contemporary. You want to let people know that right away, as close to right away as possible, because our default is that it's contemporary. So the best way to do that is I think, through very subtle character action. Just instead of saying it's the 1920s and in this part of the world, they're still using kerosene lamps. Well, Lily's lighting the kerosene lamp, and as the light flickers across the room, she's thinking of da 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 da. Well, the fact she's lighting a kerosene lamp gives us a clue that maybe not that it's 1920, but that it's definitely not a routine default of a suburban house or a city house or a country house now. And then you can slowly build those things in. And likewise with the fantasy, he could have had his character slip on the Martian sheep coat and just think, oh, so grateful to have gotten this because goodness knows the Pluto's sheep coats don't repel water. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah,
Just like
yeah.
the Martian sheep coat is so much better than the other coat I had. Oh, a Martian sheep coat? Oh, now we know we're in a totally different world without having to describe all that for pages. So just slipping those things in, a story that I'm working on now, I wanted to make it really clear that we're still in the Prohibition era, but it's told from a first person point of view. Who would not think I am telling you this story? And by the way, it's because they're in the Prohibition
Right.
era. So, like,
Right.
we're not thinking to ourselves on a daily basis, here I am in 2022 having this experience. People wouldn't do that in Prohibition era either. So instead, I have her like saying, oh, this house was built with these features, so helpful for moving bootleg alcohol. And just the word bootleg is enough for people to go, oh, this isn't right now, this is in the past. And so then you can dollop that in, just like with the individual backstory, and tell as little as you can. I mean, I have to remind myself that if people wanted to read a historical article about Prohibition, they'd be reading a historical article about Prohibition, not my novel.
Yeah.
But I appreciate what he's saying. Yeah, it's hard to let go of all the research.
Yeah. I do the idea of giving your reader broad strokes of the world. He squinted against the double suns or whatever.
There you go.
And then make it more and more detailed as time goes along. So when you talk about the fact that one sun will set 20 minutes before the other one, it's not, they're like, what? Two suns? Where did that come?
Right.
They've been set up for that. Or as you were saying, if the kerosene lamp is flickering against the rough boards of the log cabin or whatever,
There you go. Yeah.
It eases them into it without like quack, quack, quack. Here it is.
Exactly.
We had talked a little bit about the ballerina scenario with the primary character and how much of that might be on the page or not. Do you think through the backstories of the secondary characters, and do you have a different set of rules about what shows up on the page or not for them?
I do think about the secondary characters. So with the primary character, I literally lay out a timeline of like the project I was working on this past weekend. What year was she born? When was she in kindergarten? When did she graduate high school? Okay, how old are her parents? When were they born? There's a grandmother character in the novel. How old's the grandmother? When was she born? Because it starts to inform you about big events, especially since we just came through the pandemic. If you're writing something that's going to be published, if you're writing a contemporary piece and that you think is going to be published 2 years from now, well, the pandemic is part of everybody's backstory. So you kind of have to recognize how old were they, what was going on, were they in school, were they an adult, were they a kid, how might that have affected them? And you may decide it's not going to bear mentioning at all, or it could become something that helps define the character. So I do go into great detail for the main character, almost that much detail, with bios and motivations and what's their role in the story and what do they need to learn by the end of the story. They don't even realize they need to learn at the beginning of the story for a couple of the secondary characters. And then the other characters I sketch with less detail, partly because I could spend the rest of my life building bios for all my characters, and it's so much fun and it's so much easier than actually writing the story, to be honest, at least for me. But what's interesting is that as I'm creating these bios particularly for secondary characters, a scene will pop in mind of, oh, my main character and this secondary character need to discuss this, and then I just make a note of it. And often there's scenes that if I just sat down and said, I need a plot, let me sketch out a plot, that I would not have come up with. So what's fun to me about that is that then the scenes and thus the plot become very character driven, not just by the main character, but it's shaped by the personalities of all the people that the main character is interacting with. And are they allies or are they in opposition to her goals? So it's good to figure out, I think, ahead of time, this is my main character's goal. Okay, who's going to oppose her? Oh, this character is. Okay, why is that character opposing her? What's that person's backstory? What are their goals? Oh, and that immediately starts to generate conflict, which generates scenes, which creates plot.
I have to ask about the pandemic, because I know that there was a lot of conversation in the author world about, and probably in the reader world too, about how do you accommodate that? So if a writer is writing in 2022 and it's not a time specific story, like a historical story, there was a period of time when I thought, well, clearly I'm never going to have my characters shake hands ever again. And then even this year, and it's not behind us, it started feeling awkward to have two characters meet in a very business-like setting and they didn't shake hands. And so I started doing that again. And the practice I was following is that most of the people who are reading the kind of books I write are reading it more for escapism, and they don't really want to be, if they want to be reading pandemic stuff, they'll pick that out particularly, but they don't necessarily want to have pandemic references dropped into an otherwise non-pandemic focused book. How are you handling that part of the backstory? You mentioned it a little bit, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, in my historical fiction set in the 20s, part of doing the timeline for Sheriff Lily Ross was realizing what age she would have been during the influenza pandemic and thinking about, oh, did she lose anyone? Did she volunteer as a nurse? How did that shape her? And this was well before our own pandemic. So I was thinking about that historical event and I realized, oh, wait, she did work with a doctor who became her brother-in-law in the future. And so she had a view of him that ended up being at odds with her realization of who he really was in the first book in the series, The Widows. She saw some pretty gruesome tragedies at a fairly young age. She's 16, 17 during their pandemic. How did that shape her? Did it make her tough? Yes. Did it also make her more empathetic? Yes. So I ended up just referencing it again. It's like with the backstory, like she remembered, like I think I had a line or two about she and her brother-in-law have a special bond because of what they went through together, taking care of patients that they don't talk about, but it's there. And I think that's one way to think about what we've all been through, and he kind of deciding, is it a story about the pandemic and how the pandemic changed a character's life? Is it set during the pandemic? So to me, a pandemic novel would be set during the pandemic. But a novel that's set, let's say you're writing it now, you think it's going to come out in 2023. So you're thinking to your head in your head, it's 2023. Oh, by then, the beginning of it at least was several years in the past. Maybe it's something that becomes part of the character's backstory, is in they took the opportunity during the shutdown to, maybe our dancers started dancing again in her living room. And that's what led her to, I got to work out. I can't go to the gym. I'm going to put on some dance tapes and groove to the music. And that maybe is what leads her to going to take up ballroom dancing. So it becomes a realistic part of her backstory, but it's not about the pandemic. And I think most people are, I think to completely, I don't think you have to mention it, but I don't think you have to completely ignore it either. We all went through it. So it would be like ignoring that 9/11 happened. The whole world went through that. You don't have to mention it. I mean, I've certainly written books that were set after that don't reference it at all. And that's fine.
Yeah,
But
I think I
it's
see
okay to
that
reference it too.
the kinds of, so I write and read mainly thrillers, suspense, mystery kind of things. And I think the most frequent way I see people accommodate that is commenting on the changes of getting through airports.
Yeah.
It's however many years ago, we wouldn't have been standing in this TSA line or whatever. And that sets the tone for, okay, this is taking place in a more nervous, traumatized world.
Right. Yeah.
Actually, I'm having so much fun with backstory. We're probably never going to get to the second part of your
That's fine.
your Writer's Digest talk. But I'm curious if you have ever experienced or worked with a student in one of your classes who has had the experience of constructing a backstory, either on the page or for your own use or whatever, for the protagonist or secondary character, and it becomes so compelling that it becomes a story on its own. Has that happened to you?
That's a really good question, because that has not happened to me yet, but I have to admit I've had a couple of experiences where I've thought, well, wait a minute, why am I telling this story starting now when what happened 10 years ago? That's really interesting. And each time I always go back to the mantra, serve the story. Like which again sounds woo-woo, but this is the idea that found me and came to me. And this is the idea that I'm trying to manifest into the world as a story. So to serve that purpose, what do I need to do? And so far, my answer has been, well, the backstory isn't what came to you. But I think that could be perfectly legitimate. I'm not opposed to the notion of, let's say I just have a shimmer of a glimmer of an idea and I start generating backstory for a character. And if it is like, oh, wait a minute, there's the story, I think you follow that. And that's one of the joys of pre-writing. I get a little irritated when people talk about being a plotter versus a pantser, because I think that is a too simplistic way to describe the process. We all end up doing all the same things ultimately. Now, if you're a plotter, maybe you're literally plotting it out scene by scene and you stick to that. And if you're a pantser, theoretically, you've got a little bit of an idea and you just start writing. Sooner or later, before you get something together that you would actually show another human, we're all going to sit down and figure out backstory and plot points and scenes. And if we do that as we're free writing our way forward or thinking more linearly ahead of time before we actually start writing scenes, that's fine, whatever works. But I think one thing everybody should at least consider doing is what I call like setting up an infrastructure. And that's what these character descriptions are. And this figuring out of backstory and this figuring out of the setting and spending time with yourself to say, what's my goal here? Why this story? versus another idea that tapped me on the shoulder, because then I think that's a much more efficient way to work, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was working on Ann Kinnear 6, and Ann Kinnear is a woman who can sense spirits, and she has a business that her brother runs with her doing consulting gigs on this basis. And in the first book, I set up that their parents were dead because I wanted Anne to really have only her brother in her life, her brother and her brother's husband, as that's her circle. It's the three of them, because I wanted to set it up as an isolated existence. But then I wrote books 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and I got to book 6 and I thought, it's odd that a woman who can contact dead people hasn't tried to get in touch with her parents, or at least on screen hasn't tried to get in touch with her parents. And so I was baking it in as kind of a subplot of book 6. And then I thought, you know what? A woman getting in touch with her dead parents that's like a story unto itself. I really shouldn't be like jamming it into another story. And that's a different scenario because I'm not having to jump back in time. It's, she's going to be able to talk with her parents, even though they're dead. And it was just like, I think that if I had thought through the backstory more clearly than just, oh, I'm going to have her parents be dead because I want her and her brother and her brother's husband to be this little isolated group of 3, I would have realized sooner in the series that this was probably something that I should address and not leave hanging out there. And then I guess that maybe this is a slightly different question. Have you had the experience of thinking through the backstory of a character that you anticipated would be a secondary character, and then that becomes so compelling that they either become a more major character in that story or they get a story of their own?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Yeah. When I first started working on the Kinship Historical Mysteries, they're set in the 20s, inspired by Ohio's true first female sheriff. And in my imagining of her, she's Sheriff Lily Ross. I thought that, of course, I would be telling the story from her point of view, period. And then I started creating characters around her. And I realized that one of the characters, this was for The Widows, the first book in the series, a woman named Marvina, who was friends with Lily's husband, but Lily was not aware. And they were just friends because I want readers to like Lily's deceased husband. But Lily wasn't aware that Marvina was a friend of her husband, Daniel. And obviously, this is shocking to her to discover. And Marvina just was such a strong character in my head that I realized, oh, she understands Daniel in a different way than Lily understands Daniel. And Daniel's murder is what they're both trying to solve, which means I have 2 point of view characters now, Lily and Marvina. And that's how the first novel is set up. And it actually set the tone for the pattern for the whole series, because each book is Lily and another character from Kinship, the town and county that she works in. So yeah, it was interesting to have Marvina start as just this little sort of part of Daniel's backstory. And then she became so strong in my imagination. It sounds, again, woo-woo, but it was like she just kind of looked at me and said, excuse me, I have a voice too. I have things to say. And it just made sense. It like clicked in my head. Of course, she's going to be a point of view character. So then I had to figure out a lot more about her backstory, which added to the depth of the story overall. But it took about a third of a draft of a novel and brainstorming for me to figure out, oh, this is what I need to do to serve the story. It has to be the 2 women.
Yeah. And I think even if you haven't fully thought it through yet, because sometimes you just can't, you can still make it work.
Right.
Like with the Anne series, there's a character that I thought was going to be just kind of a walk-on character in the first book, The Sense of Death, who is early on in the series is Anne's mentor. And then as the series progresses, becomes more like a colleague to her. His name is Garrick Mazur. And I enjoyed Garrick so much, and the readers enjoyed Garrick so much, that I made Garrick a major player in the second book. And it was super fun. So Garrick is this very kind of curmudgeonly, abrupt, socially inept guy. And even though I hadn't fully thought it through in book 1, it was super fun to figure out Garrick's backstory in book 2 and show the kinder, gentler side of Garrick in book 2 in flashbacks to his earlier life. So, I don't think people have to despair if they've gotten partway through a series and say, oh, I should have
Right.
understood this better before. But
You got to give
writers.
yourself, it's creative writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the process of discovery is both the challenge and the joy of doing this. And as much time as I spend on figuring out character backstory, and that generates scenes that then I can stitch together for plot, and figuring out setting, at some point you have to actually start writing those scenes as you anticipate a reader might encounter them. And in that process, new information is going to pop forward. And you have to be open to that and willing to go with that flow.
Great. Well, Sharon, thank you so much. This has been so interesting. We hit both backstory and back setting and all sorts of other aspects of back. So please let the listeners and viewers know where they can find out more about you and everything you do online.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, you can find me at sharonshort.com, my website. And I have a secondary website for my pen name, Jess Montgomery author.com. And on Sharon Short, you'll find links to some articles I've written for Writer's Digest and to Writer's Digest University. And on jessmontgomeryauthor.com, you'll find some sample chapters of my novels. So
great. Thank you so much.
thank you.